tree line was so close that Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore could see individual muzzle flashes from the North Vietnamese soldiers advancing on his perimeter. His radio operator relayed the strike coordinates to the orbiting Sky Raiders, exactly as Moore had called them, close enough to his own position that some of his own men would feel the heat on their faces. The fire that followed did not fall in front of the assault. It fell directly onto the ground the assault was standing on. Landing Zone X-ray in the Ia Drang Valley of South Vietnam's Central Highlands, November 1965, had become the first major battle between American ground forces and the North Vietnamese Army, and Moore's battalion was badly outnumbered, surrounded on three sides, and running out of options that didn't involve calling fire onto his own lines. To understand how a jellied gasoline mixture invented in a Harvard laboratory during the Second World War ended up saving an American battalion in a Vietnamese valley 23 years later, we have to go back to a football field outside Harvard Stadium on the 4th of July, 1942. Moore's request that morning went out under a rarely used emergency code, Broken Arrow, a signal reserved for an American ground unit in danger of being overrun, one that automatically diverted every available strike aircraft in the theater toward a single set of coordinates. Within the hour, Air Force fighters, Marine Corps aircraft, and Army artillery batteries positioned miles away were all being funneled through a single forward air controller orbiting above X-ray, stacking aircraft in a holding pattern and feeding them onto target one at a time as fast as ordnance could be dropped. Napalm strikes made up a significant share of those sorties, chosen specifically because they could be placed closer to Moore's own perimeter than high explosive without the same risk of friendly casualties from blast overpressure alone. Chemist Louis Fieser led a small team working in secrecy for the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, tasked with solving a specific problem. Standard gasoline burned too fast and spread too unpredictably to be useful as an incendiary weapon. Thickened gasoline, gelled with natural rubber, burned longer and clung to whatever it hit. But Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia's rubber-producing regions had cut off the primary source of that thickening agent. Fieser's team needed a substitute, and after considerable experimentation, they landed on a combination of aluminum salts derived from naphthenic acid and palmitic acid. The name napalm came directly from those two words fused together. On that July afternoon, Fieser's team detonated a test bomb filled with the new mixture in a puddle on a soccer field near Harvard's football stadium, and by Fieser's own account, the performance was immediately unmistakably impressive. Napalm entered combat the following year, first through flamethrowers used during the Allied invasion of Sicily, then as an aerial incendiary weapon across the Pacific theater. American forces used it extensively against deeply entrenched Japanese positions on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where conventional high-explosive bombs often failed to reach defenders dug into caves, bunkers, and fortified tunnel networks. 2/3 of all napalm bombs produced during the Second World War were expended in the Pacific, and by the war's final year, it had become a central tool of American strategic bombing, deployed over Japanese cities alongside conventional incendiaries in raids that burned through roughly 60% of Tokyo. Korea confirmed napalm's value in a different kind of fight entirely, one closer to what American forces would eventually encounter in Vietnam. Outnumbered United Nations ground troops, frequently facing massed Chinese and North Korean infantry assaults, depended on American air superiority to level the numbers. At the Battle of Outpost Harry, and across dozens of engagements like it, napalm became the preferred answer to human wave tactics precisely because it did something conventional explosives could not. It didn't need a direct hit. A napalm canister released from a low-flying aircraft tumbled as it fell, splashing and spreading its burning contents across a wide area on impact, filling low ground, trench lines, and dug-in positions with fire that conventional bombs simply flew past. On an average day during the war's heaviest fighting, American and Allied pilots expended tens of thousands of gallons of it in close air support alone. By the time American ground combat units deployed to Vietnam in strength in 1965, Napalm's tactical role had been refined by 2 prior wars into something close to doctrine. General Earl Wheeler, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later explained the logic in blunt operational terms. Conventional bombs, he noted, needed to land essentially on top of a defensive position to be effective. Napalm did not. Its splash and spread pattern let it flow directly into foxholes, tunnel entrances, drainage ditches, and the kind of improvised fighting positions Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces relied on throughout the war. Against anti-aircraft positions specifically, Wheeler noted that the enemy typically dug a pit and placed the gun crew inside it, precisely the kind of target napalm's flowing, splashing ignition pattern was suited to reach when a direct hit would have been required for conventional ordnance to do the same job. The delivery method itself mattered as much as the chemistry inside the canister. Napalm bombs were built to tumble end over end as they fell, rather than dropping nose first like conventional ordnance, a design choice that let the canister rupture on impact and spread its contents across a long, low arc rather than concentrating detonation at a single point. That tumbling, splashing pattern was what let a single canister blanket a tree line, a trench system, or a stretch of open ground an assault was crossing, rather than simply cratering the specific spot where it touched down. For a forward air controller trying to break up a determined assault forming along an irregular perimeter in dense terrain, that spread pattern was often more valuable than raw explosive yield. The version deployed in Vietnam differed chemically from the aluminum soap mixture Fieser had developed in 1942. Napalm B, adopted for its simplicity and lower cost, combined gasoline, benzene, and polystyrene in a mixture simple enough to produce that it earned the nickname bathtub chemistry among the chemists who worked with it. The Pentagon solicited bids from polystyrene manufacturers in 1965, and the winning contract went to a company then ranked 75th on the list of American military contractors, better known at the time for a kitchen product than for chemical warfare. The Dow Chemical Company would become the sole supplier of napalm to American forces in Vietnam for the next 4 years, a fact that would follow the company for decades after its napalm contract ended. Back at Landing Zone X-Ray, that same splash and spread quality was the only thing standing between Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and being overrun. Roughly 450 American troopers had been dropped by helicopter into a clearing surrounded by 2 full North Vietnamese Army regiments, more than 2,000 enemy soldiers converging from multiple directions in the opening battle of large-scale American ground involvement in the war. Moore's perimeter held, in significant part, because close air support, napalm chief among it, could be walked in danger close to friendly lines, in a way conventional artillery, with its wider margin for error, could not be trusted to match. Forward air controllers worked directly with battalion command to place strikes within meters of American foxholes, close enough that Moore's own men described feeling the heat of napalm ignitions meant for the North Vietnamese assault forming just beyond their perimeter. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The weapon behind the headline, not just the headline itself. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. That proximity was not incidental to napalm's usefulness in a battle like Ia Drang. It was the entire point. Artillery rounds carried a blast radius that made truly close support risky in a fluid, 3-sided battle where friendly and enemy positions sometimes stood less than 50 meters apart. Napalm's fire spread outward from where it landed, but did so predictably along the ground rather than through concussive blast waves that could just as easily catch friendly troops in a crowded perimeter. A skilled forward air controller could put a napalm strike almost on top of an assault forming against a tree line without the same risk of American casualties that an artillery barrage at the same range would have carried. At X-Ray, and in the fighting that followed at the nearby landing zone Albany days later, that distinction mattered as much as any single weapon system deployed during the entire battle. The human cost of napalm, on whichever side of a tree line it landed, was never in serious dispute among the people who studied it. Burning at temperatures between roughly 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius, napalm did not simply burn skin. It adhered to it, continuing to combust as victims attempted to extinguish or remove it, and in enclosed spaces, its combustion consumed enough oxygen to generate lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide, even among people who were never directly touched by the fire itself. Physicians who treated napalm burns during the war described injuries that conventional burn treatment protocols struggled to address, wounds that went deeper and healed slower than equivalent thermal injuries from other sources. That human cost became impossible for the American public to ignore as the war progressed and television brought combat footage into homes for the first time in American history. A January 1967 photo essay in Ramparts magazine showing Vietnamese children burned by napalm strikes reportedly influenced Martin Luther King Jr.'s decision to publicly oppose the war that year. Student protests against Dow Chemical's napalm contract began in 1966 and spread rapidly across American college campuses, turning corporate recruiting visits into flashpoints and eventually contributing to Dow's decision to end napalm production in 1969, 4 years after it had become the military's sole supplier. None of that controversy changed the tactical calculus on the ground while the war continued. Between 1963 and 1973, American forces dropped approximately 388,000 tons of napalm across Vietnam, roughly 10 times the tonnage expended during the entire Korean War, and nearly 20 times the amount used across the Pacific Theater in World War II. It remained standard ordnance for close air support throughout the conflict, specifically because nothing else available to American pilots could reach a dug-in position, break up a massed assault, or clear a landing zone perimeter with the same combination of speed, spread, and psychological effect. Enemy forces who had learned to survive artillery barrages by staying low in fortified positions had no equivalent defense against fire that flowed into the position itself. Veterans of X-ray and the fighting that followed at Landing Zone Albany often described the sound and heat of those danger-close strikes as almost as unsettling as the assault they were meant to break. A wall of ignition close enough to feel through a foxhole wall, followed immediately by the strange, sudden quiet of an attack that had simply stopped advancing. That combination, overwhelming and immediate, was precisely what made napalm different from artillery in the eyes of the infantrymen who depended on it. A barrage could be walked closer over several minutes, adjusted round by round. A napalm run was binary, there and then finished, and either it broke the assault or it didn't, with almost no room for a second attempt before the moment that mattered had already passed. Landing Zone X-ray held. Moore's battalion, badly outnumbered and cut off from easy reinforcement for much of the battle, survived an engagement that military historians would later cite as the first large-scale test of American airmobile doctrine against a determined North Vietnamese main force enemy. The close air support that made that survival possible called in danger close enough that American troops felt its heat through their own perimeter, would remain one of the most consequential and most controversial tools in the entire American arsenal for the rest of the war. A weapon invented on a Harvard football field to solve a rubber shortage that ended up deciding more than once whether an American position held or fell.